Well, I don't want to keep you any longer, so let's get started. This is the Essential Work of Vermont School Boards webinar. My name is Susan Holson. I am the Director of Education Services for the VSBA, and I'm joined this evening by Carrie Lamb, who's our Director of Operations, and you've probably spoken to her at least once already. We're really glad you're here with us this evening. We're going to be going through a lot of material. This is an adaptation of what was a 2.5-hour workshop, but I promise I will get you out of here in an hour. Just a couple of logistics. Questions are always welcome. You have a question box on your screen. You can type anything in there at any time. During the course of the webinar, Carrie will sort of be tracking those questions and summarizing them and popping in as they're relevant so that we can address those issues as they come up. There'll be an evaluation that we'll be mailing to you at the end of the webinar, and we encourage you to please help us make sure we're doing a good job for you by filling that out. And then we'll also be following up by email. You'll get a copy of the slides and summary information and other resources that we may speak about during the course of the webinar. And all of our webinars are archived both on the VSBA website, which is www.vtvsba.org, and also on our YouTube channel. Carrie also asked me to address this particular question tonight. Since most of you are new board members, you may not know very much about us here at VSBA, but we want to make sure you get to know us. And one of the ways that we do that is through our webinar series on topics that are relevant and germane and sometimes timely for school board members. And those webinars are always free to our members. By the way, you're all members. Welcome. This evening's a little bit different because we will send out a workbook that accompanies this content, and that's a fairly substantial booklet, and so we do have to charge for that. So if you would please, some superintendents buy those ahead for board members, and some get hold of them through board chairs and whatever. So in your notes section, if you already have the workbook, please let us know, and then we'll make sure not to charge you for it. Thank you. So the agenda for tonight, we're going to buzz through some information about roles and responsibilities of school board members. We'll talk a little bit about education governance in Vermont, which is changing as we speak, and then we'll focus mostly on the essential work of Vermont school boards, which is a platform that we here at VSBA developed over a couple of years. It's based heavily on the National School Boards Association platform of the same type, but it is very much customized to address our situation in Vermont, both in terms of governance and laws and best practices. So as I mentioned before we get into the work of school boards, we'll take a look at the system of education governance at the state level so you can understand how school boards fit into that structure. The legislature and the courts really provide guidance at the statewide level, and the governor's office, the State Board of Education, and the Agency of Education, all of which are obviously state agencies, execute and develop administrative regulations for the laws passed by the legislatures and interpreted by the courts. The local school board has a unique role. It's implementation at the local level, but you're also really capturing the values of your community and making sure that your schools are addressing them. So what is the role of a school board? You got a really easy job here. You're tasked as a trustee with making sure that every student has high quality education, that the public is getting a good return on its investment that it is paying for through taxes, of course, and that your system operates efficiently, effectively, and ethically. So what we like to say is that you're both the first and the last. You're first in terms of setting a vision, policy, parameters, and priorities. And then you swoop in at the end and monitor progress and make sure that the the system is accountable to taxpayers. You're also really charged with making sure there's clarity for your superintendent and other administrators so that they can operate the schools and with their expertise and their skills and their creativity. You do have a commitment to your public in terms of financial oversight, and you want to make sure that you've earned their trust, which you do through your efficient and ethical operations. Now, Vermont has sort of a unique structure in that many of us are also part of supervisory unions. A supervisory union is an overseer of school districts that is a structure in place to benefit the districts that participate in it. So there's mutual accountability between the supervisory union board, who hires and evaluates the superintendent, and that superintendent who is charged with making sure that you're delivering high quality education. District boards make up the supervisory union, so sometimes boards forget that supervisory, they're part of the SU, and they talk about it like it's a foreign entity, but it is yours. So do all that you can to reinforce the importance of your board engaging in the region, because it is better for students. It's critical that the SU board has a common mission and that gets shared with all of the member districts, and that everybody has the same commitment to effective hiring, working with, and evaluating the superintendent. This is a very short video which I've borrowed from the Texas School Boards Association. I think it's a sweet 2 minutes on the high-level work of a school board. So bear with me while we watch this one.
My name is Rachel, and I'm in the 6th grade. I was invited to go to a school board meeting to get an award, but I didn't know what the school board did. So I asked my grandpa Freddie, since he used to be on the board. He said, well, school boards are kind of like the grandparents of the school.
They want good things for the students and staff. Even though grandparents aren't always around, we do our best to help you learn and grow. Let me see if I can explain it in another way. Think of the school board team as building a bridge between the community and the schools. They're your voice. Board members listen to parents, community members, school staff, and even the students about their hopes and dreams for their schools. They share these messages with the superintendent and other school leaders, and they advocate for their school district by speaking up for them with other elected officials and within the community. Another important job of the board is to provide direction for the schools. School board members choose a destination for the district. They might like the students to go to Topeka, Kansas, Paris, France, or even Mars. But they don't tell the staff how to get there. They empower the superintendent, staff, and students to choose their path. The board also makes a lot of decisions, like hiring a superintendent. The superintendent is the leader who makes sure the daily operations of the schools run well. The superintendent helps determine the best routes on the map, along with the staff and students. The school board also ensures that resources are in place so that the staff can complete their work and make sure students can reach their destinations. Let's say that the schools want their students to be able to play a musical instrument if they love, or fix a car, or understand algebra or other opportunities. The board makes sure that the school district has the money, staff, and materials in the right places at the right time. To ensure success, the board and superintendent team help students complete their journey in their local schools and prepare them for the future.
After talking to Grandpa Freddie, I had a much better understanding of what school boards do. They build a bridge so that the community and the schools can communicate, and they set destinations for the schools so that I can reach my goals. The school board looks out for me, just like my grandpa and grandma do.
So I think that's a really nice overview of what the school board's role is and how it interacts with the other players in the education system. We're going to before we go any further, can I ask you each to just type into your question box just the length of time you've been serving on your school board, so I know who's out there and who we're talking to and what your needs are. Get a better picture of that. Okay, so it seems that those of you who have answered are brand new board members, which is terrific. So thank you again for being here with us tonight, and maybe more importantly, thank you for serving. So let's do a little case study here. Take a minute to read this. And now I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. Please enter your responses, and you don't have to answer each bullet point, but your general impressions, please answer in that question box, and I'll read them out to share them with everybody else. So far, Chris has chimed in saying it's not really the role of the board member to prescribe curriculum, right? Michael joined him in saying it's not necessarily the board's job to set curriculum, though perhaps, let's see if I can see your whole comment here, Michael. I'm not sure that I can. There we go. Though perhaps there are occasions when curriculum questions might come up when the board is setting goals and expectations. Amy added, it's not really the responsibility of a board member to introduce academic materials like curriculum. Trish said the discussion should come to the board if the superintendent has evaluated curriculum changed and deemed it worthy. Chris then adds, maybe the curriculum committee is the place to have this discussion. Not really a board issue, says Shannon. It's a great program. Perhaps he could check in with the math department. And Katie has added, not really a board issue. If it's oh, I'm sorry, Katie has said, I believe that the discussion should involve the principal to suggest looking into new curriculum. And finally, Mary Lou says, this is not appropriate for a school board member. Sharing information is okay, but the superintendent should choose the time for such discussions. We hire the experts to make academic decisions. And I thank you for that. That's a perfect closure on this one. Yes, of course we hire experts to make the academic decisions. It is not a requirement of school board membership that you be an educator, though some are. In fact, the experts are the administrators that we hire to run our school systems. So all of you pretty much came to the conclusion that curriculum is not the purview of the board, and that is completely true. The only time that and by the way, I think it was Chris had some mention of a curriculum committee. There really shouldn't be a board curriculum committee because it's not a board function. The only time that a curriculum conversation would come up in front of the board is if you have established goals in a particular academic area and the outcomes are not progressing towards the goals. And then you can ask your superintendent, what are we going to do about this? And it would be up to the superintendent to then say, well, perhaps we should explore other curricula. So we have, as I mentioned, developed this platform called The Essential Work of School Boards. If you haven't already received the booklet, you will be getting that from us. It's a comprehensive workbook that takes you through each of these 6 domains and a couple of others. And we also have a companion toolkit on our website, which is essentially you're now looking at that landing page. So each of these 6 domain areas are clickable, and behind each one you'll find documentation about the roles and responsibilities of the different players as pertains to that area. You'll find some recommended policies from our model policy manual, and you'll also find additional resources that help define these areas of board work. So let's just dig right in here. Engaging the community and having a vision. This is a big one. This is maybe the hardest part of your work. So the purpose of the community engagement is to ensure that the school improvement is done with the community. And by community, what I'm talking about here is all your stakeholders. So it should go without saying that you're talking about your superintendent, your students, your teachers, your principals, your parents, but you're also talking about the non-parent taxpayers in your community, because they're the ones who are footing the bill. The statistics statewide is that only about 25 to 30%, maybe even less than that, of taxpayers have school-age children. So you need the support of your whole community if you're going to be able to support education. Therefore, get their input as to what that looks like. What is it important for students to know? And here are really the key questions when you're forming your vision. What do we want students to know, to be able to do? What kind of experiences do we want? What long-term outcomes do we want? And finally, and this is where the board really steps in here, given our limited resources, what are our priorities? And that has to be reflective of your community's values. So I recently was talking to a board member whose community really valued outdoor education, and they were willing to sacrifice other things to make sure their kids got outside. That's great. That's the role of the local board. So school board has a lot of vision-related questions it should ask itself. Does the school board play a central role in fostering and guiding community dialogue about the vision for its schools? Is the community broadly defined to include all of those stakeholders? And I'll add to the ones I've already mentioned, your public service organizations, your business community, they all play in too. Does your district or supervisory union's vision reflect the student achievement expectations and needs of the community? Does school board and superintendent act as a team to communicate that vision and make it a reality? Is there a strategic plan in place to implement that vision, and does that strategic plan focus on student achievement? Is the community engaged in that planning process? What policies need to be in place to support those strategic plan initiatives? And how do we continuously assure that our vision is future focused? So we're now beginning to put some meat on the bones of the board work. You also have questions for your superintendent when it comes to your vision. Have specific plans been developed to engage the community? What are the district's student achievement strengths and weaknesses? How do we compare, and where does this vision need to drive us? What are the short-term and long-term goals of the strategic plan, and how do they relate to the vision and also promote student achievement? How about school improvement plans? Are they integrated with the strategic plans? What strategies will be used to improve achievement, and how were they selected? And are those best practices research-based? And those are questions for the superintendent and the administration. And finally, what indicators are you going to use to measure and report back to us, the board, at the district level, the school level, the supervisory union level? Any questions about that before I move on? Anything you want to talk about relative to vision or community engagement? and how that drives the board's work? Okay, I don't see any questions, but feel free to chime in anytime. So policy might be one of the most important jobs of a board. It's certainly one of the central jobs because the board needs to make sure that the district achieves educational results for students and does so in a legal way that meets community expectations. So by setting policies, the board articulates the values and concerns of the community, and since you're trustees of that community, they're trusting you to oversee the schools. That's really important. Once the board has spoken in policy, it then delegates to the administration the authority to interpret the policy, which is often done through written procedures. So there'll be a procedures manual or handbook. The board should regularly monitor for policy compliance, and do remember that if it's important enough to be addressed in policy, it's important enough to be monitored. Board superintendent partnership. And this is a tough one because this has really been evolving over time, and not all districts in the state are really following what we now see as best practices. Some are steeped in older ways of doing things. So as new board members, this is a plea to you to understand that what we're talking about here is best practices. It may not be exactly the way your board is doing it right now, but it's where we're hoping that you'll be heading. So maybe the most important decision that the board makes is hiring the superintendent, and that's the supervisory union board who officially has the authority to hire, but generally will confer with district boards to get their input on a candidate. Boards provide oversight. They don't manage day-to-day operations of the school system. According to Vermont state statute, the superintendent is the chief executive officer of the district, so therefore responsible for all aspects of operation and for providing educational leadership. And that's a critical piece right there. So the board sets the goals, assures there's good communications between the board and the administration, and establishes and monitors clear systems for accountability. The superintendent, as I said, oversees operations and educational leadership and is accountable to both the supervisory union and district boards. The principal provides instructional leadership and day-to-day operations generally it's at the building level. So the supervisory union action plan, priorities, and initiatives are driving what's going on at the building level, and the principal is accountable to the superintendent. Some of our smaller districts have very close relationships with the principals because the district tends to have one school and the principal is at that level at the school. But here's where the hard part comes in. Boards assure that schools are well run, but they don't run them. And it is so trying to thread that needle and not go in the weeds and get involved in the day-to-day operations, whether it's the school bus routes or how many I don't know, monitors you need on the playground at recess. Those are not board level decisions. Those are operational decisions that should be staying with your administrative team. So the chain of command that goes on here is the board has the vision, the policy, and the resources. The superintendent is the system leader who then delegates to the principal at the building level. The principal is responsible to the superintendent, not to the board. The superintendent in kind is responsible to the board. So employing a well-qualified and capable superintendent, the board needs to make sure that there is mutual accountability between itself and the superintendent. And the board's job in that accountability is to make sure that the superintendent is getting clear direction and setting and establishing priorities that everybody agrees with. The superintendent then has to deliver on that, and that's their responsibility to the board. And just to clarify some of this a little bit further, here's the board's role in the hiring process as is delineated actually in statute. So when it's a licensed position, a teacher, a principal, a nurse, the superintendent, technically, by law, the superintendent is the one who nominates the candidate and brings that one candidate to the board for either approval or disapproval. Now, in practice, if let's say it's a superintendent, let's say that we're hiring for a principal, in practice, the superintendent is going to have a committee that will include some board members, some teachers, possibly some students, parents, community members. But ultimately, that body only makes a recommendation to the superintendent, which he or she can then accept or decline. For non-licensed staff, the superintendent may hire and dismiss without board approval. That means you don't need to know who's working as a paraprofessional in your building or who's the custodian. Similarly, the superintendent can dismiss subject to whatever collective bargaining agreement is in place. The superintendent doesn't need the board to sign off on a dismissal. And the board really needs to reserve its involvement because ultimately you may end up being called upon to serve as sort of a quasi-judicial body hearing any kind of dismissal or discipline cases. So the superintendent and his or her assignees have a lot of responsibility in the hiring process, most of it. Everybody's favorite topic, budgets. The board obviously gets involved with the budget and then throughout the year has an obligation to be monitoring that budget and providing financial oversight. So the financial resources support the delivery of education, and the board's role here is making sure that the system has sufficient resources to achieve its mission in providing high-level oversight, financial oversight, to assure that the resources are properly managed on behalf of the taxpayer. So this has to be a priority because at the end of the year when you're trying to get next year's budget approved, well, it's really in the middle of the year, you need to be able to tell your community what's going on. So managing those resources, financial resources responsibly is foundational to achieving your educational mission. If you're in a evolving structure right now, as many of our school boards are throughout the state, you may have an unusual opportunity to build your budget really from the ground up and ask your administration, what is it that we really need to accomplish the goals that we've set, rather than inheriting legacy structures and staffing levels, etc. So I'm going to ask you to chime in again. Your budget shows the values of your school system better than any other document. Is that true, do you think? So here are some of the responses. Michael gives us an emphatic no. Shannon, you've lost your audio? Chris says, ideally, the budget should reflect the values, but he or she, Chris, I'm sorry, isn't sure that that's always practical. Mary Lou is saying that, where are we here? It's not necessarily true, given the number of cuts that we have to make. It represents the best we can do. Troy disagrees, saying the vision statement shows the values. Oh, good, Shannon, thank you. Glad you're back. Chris says fixed costs, contractual obligations, and other external factors drive the budget. Thank you, Chris, for the clarification. And the budget should align with the mission and vision of the organization in theory, is what Lynn says. And Lynn, I guess you really captured what everybody else was getting at. Ideally, the values of your school system, which is in fact what's in your vision statement and your strategic plan, are what you're building your budget to accomplish. However, as some of you have pointed out, there are some serious amounts of fixed expenses that we need to make, we need to make sure the building is structurally sound. We need to make sure that the students have what they need for curriculum. But there is an opportunity to prioritize, and that gets reflected in the budget. So the cuts that somebody had mentioned before, it's true, we have had to cut budgets lately. The economic environment has been challenging, but different school districts have cut it in different ways, and that's where the values come into play, maintaining their most important things. So Katie chimed in on this. While the amounts dedicated to certain areas may differ between school districts, there may be other factors in play, and of course that's true. We do have state standards for educational outcomes, and so we are mandated to ensure that we're addressing those. And Michael, who had the first word, gets the last word. The budget isn't even necessarily accurate with respect to expenses in that budget year. And a budget is not a good place to see values. There are many other places to see a school's values. Well, I'm going to push back a little bit here, Michael, because I think that the values are the things that we fund. And as I said, different districts, when faced with budget challenges, approach different lines differently. So some places will value, I'm going to make this up, may decide that above all else they really need to commit resources to rebuilding their athletic fields. And if necessary, they're going to have to cut some of the foreign languages to make that happen. And that's that community's decision, and that's what they're willing to fund. So the budget is a challenge. It's particularly a challenge for those of us board volunteers who are not steeped with a financial history. You're looking at some pretty big numbers. I know when I was a school board member, the numbers that I was looking at were a lot bigger than my checkbook. And so it was really important to get behind them and understand them. And toward that end, I haven't scheduled it yet, but I anticipate that we'll be putting on a webinar helping school board members read financial statements and understand what's behind them. So we talked before about monitoring progress. It's really important to monitor what you're doing. And there are many different aspects of board work that we need to monitor. Student outcomes, of course. How are we going to monitor those? Well, the superintendent is going to provide us with some metrics that we can use in assessing our progress in the strategic plan for the district. Some of those will be, well, they should all be data driven, but they don't all have to be the test scores. So there are a lot of other elements that we can be looking at, like graduation rates, student absenteeism, faculty absenteeism. Do you have a workplace problem in your school? So there are other ways to be getting to what the health of the district. Test scores obviously are going to be one component, but now as we're moving toward proficiency-based learning, it's going to look a little bit different too. And so how will the board get reports that will get to the heart of the progress and student outcomes? I mentioned earlier that the supervisory union board hires the superintendent. They also do a superintendent review, or should, once a year at a minimum, and that can be comprised of reports that the superintendent is giving throughout the year on different factors that altogether speak to his or her goals. We also mentioned policy reviews. So first of all, you want to make sure that there's compliance with your policies, but also that your policies are still accurate and current and encompassing any changes in educational law. So we recommend that you review your policy manual every 3 to 5 years, by which I mean in some sort of rotation. So I don't suggest that you sit down with the whole policy manual once every 3 years and go through the whole thing. But I do believe it's important to make sure that everything is still current and up to date. We talked about financial oversight. So that's both monitoring the budget as it's being spent and being a good and critical customer of the audit that is done annually. You need to understand where the health of the district is financially. And finally, to go back on your vision statement and make sure that you're still describing the vision that your community has for education, and that that vision statement is guiding everything that you are doing with your board work. Monitoring progress toward the vision is absolutely maybe the most important part of your job. You're accountable to the community to make sure that the district is making reasonable progress in achieving outcomes for students, and that the system is operating in compliance with policies, laws, and regulations. So the board needs to be monitoring both of these areas regularly in order to know what's actually going on. In order for the administrators to be able to produce evidence, the board needs to be really clear on what those learning outcome expectations are, and also those of the system's operations. And again, everything is done under the umbrella of the vision. The policies and the strategic plan and the goals all flow from that. So how do you go about monitoring? Well, you need to understand what's already in place, and you need to expect data that's going to show you progress. Your superintendent is really the one who can provide you with what kind of data is available for you to look at to assess progress on your specific learning outcomes that you as a board have prioritized. And then the board needs to make sure that it understands the data. So more important than the actual numbers will be the interpretation of what they mean. And finally, we get to effective and ethical operations. And this is a challenging piece for a lot of boards because people are coming from all different backgrounds with all different expectations about what boards really do. So I'm going to repeat something I said before. School boards do not operate schools. You assure that the schools are well run. And as elected officials, you have to act with integrity and adhere to high ethical standards. So lawful and effective operations are necessary for a strong board, and that strength is characterized with well-organized meetings and agendas that focus discussion and decision-making. And those are created by your board chair and the superintendent, hopefully with an opportunity for board member input. Generally, you will have an opportunity to chime in on that. You also want to make sure that the engaged board members have the information that's necessary to make the decisions that are on the agenda, and that everything that you've got in place is legally compliant. And there are some interesting laws that pertain to the work that we do. One of the most important obligations of a board is to negotiate contracts with employees, the collective bargaining process. And that's a little bit antithetical to a lot of what we've been talking about, where I've been stressing how the board's work is not operational. But according to the Vermont law, it is in fact the board that undertakes negotiations with your collective bargaining units. So what do you have going on now? You really need to familiarize yourself with the current master agreement, and you need to understand everything that the unions are proposing so that you can assess their, I'll call them demands, in the realm of your vision and your taxes. Because, let's repeat, you have a responsibility to deliver a return on investment for your community. VSBA does do some specialty workshops around the state. We have 2 more in this series on teacher negotiations. If they are convenient and possible for either you or at least somebody on your board to attend, we highly recommend it. They are run by a consultant whom we've teamed with, who is a former UNISERV director for Vermont NEA. So he is very well versed in what they do and how they do it at the negotiate and prior to the negotiations table. Most boards have some sort of negotiations committee, and if that's likely to be a committee that you're going to sit on or one in which you have particular interest, again, I encourage you to attend one of these 2 remaining. They're Saturdays. If you're in Montpelier, I'll see you there. As far as effective and ethical operations, one of the issues is that the public can and should have a voice in board deliberations, but no person, no member of the public has the right to obstruct board deliberations or hijack the meeting. So my little catchphrase here is that board meetings are public meetings. You have an obligation for transparency, but they are not meetings of the public. So you're not really, it's not your best practice to engage with the public that may be there on a particular issue. There's a public comment period on every agenda that's stipulated by Robert's Rules of Order, which are mandated use for school boards. So there's always some way for the public to have a say, and there are very clear stipulations through Vermont's open meeting law as to how meetings and how and when meetings get warned and agendas are posted in advance in very specific locations that have been identified by your district. The chair needs to make sure that the public is feeling welcome at the meetings, but also that the meetings stay focused on the agenda and remain productive, because remember, you as a body are there to conduct your work. So often boards adopt a policy or at least a practice that allows citizens an opportunity to speak up at the meetings on whatever their topic of interest is, but the board chair may establish a time constraint or some other rules that limit what the how the public participates. So with that, I call you back to your central responsibilities as a board member: high quality education for all students, good return on investment for all taxpayers, and effective, efficient, and ethical operations. So, what questions do you have? Carrie? I have lost my little questions box, so I'm relying on you here.
Okay, policies for educational results was mentioned. Can you share an example? Troy has asked.
A policy for educational results would be something that pertains to the outcomes that you're looking for. So I'll make up an example. You might have a policy in place to ensure that every student has access to appropriate curriculum. And then it will be the administrative job to put that into practice.
Okay, and Katie asked that we let her know when the budget courses are. They are
Okay.
generally in late fall, in October timeframe. So keep an eye out on your emails that come from us and on our website. There's a place to sign up for webinars. Anytime you want to go to the website, you can see what's coming up in our webinars. You can also see we have a webinars archive that you can go to view former webinars. And that's the last question, Susan.
Wow. So I will give you the 1-minute rundown. The Vermont School Boards Association is a member-owned organization. We are a staff of 4, whom you see here, and we have a board made up of 23 members that represent 2 each from 11 districts around the state, as well as our president, who's elected by the membership. I'm sorry, elected by the board. So we are here exclusively to serve you. I'm here, I do the board education, the training, professional development kind of work. Sue Siglowski, my colleague, is our Director of Legal and Policy Services. So if you have questions about whether you can go into executive session at over a particular topic, or you have questions about the open meeting law or any other legal matter that is determined by statute, she's available to you either by email or phone. We do not represent you as a board. We may advise you to get your own legal counsel if you're into a situation that requires it, but we can give you the overview of that. Sue and our executive director, Nicole Mace, are also registered lobbyists. They're over in the State House every day, I would say, during legislative session. They attend committee meetings, they attend general sessions, they testify regularly on issues that are of import to the public education system in Vermont. So this year, as you probably have read, that would include education funding issues, special education issues, early childhood education issues. Carrie, who you've met this evening, runs the show, so she is on top of anything you need to know that's procedural, logistical, and we are, as I said, we are always here for you because that is our reason for being. Most of us are former school board members and have that perspective that we bring to our work.
Susan, we
Yes.
do have one more question that's come up now.
Great.
Mary Lou says, there are differences between larger school systems and smaller school boards. On small boards, everyone has some relation to the school, which in one sense is wonderful. Everyone's involved in the school activities. School board members have children in the school, have spouses or children teaching or working for the school, or other relatives who work within the school district. This closeness can create problems. Can you discuss these differences?
Oh boy, that's a great question and chock full of insight. Yes, in the smaller communities, there is a lot often there is a lot of overlap in the relationships with schools. Any board member who is also a parent of children in the school district has some of that built in as well. And we have many board members in the state whose spouses are teachers, not in the district necessarily where they're board members, but the relationships are very tight. It is very hard to stand back and remove yourself when you're in the building regularly as a parent or as a member of the community or as an interested party on any given issue. But you do have specific obligations as a board member to maintain a neutrality on issues unless and until you are called upon to perform this quasi-judicial role that I mentioned earlier. So if you happen to be shopping in your local store and somebody, one of your neighbors stops you and says, my kid's teacher this year is really making a mess of things and you're on the board, can't you do something about that? I find a polite way to say, no, I can't, because that is not my job. So what you would say to that friend, that neighbor is, you know what, that's really the principal's job. Have you talked to the teacher? If it's not appropriate, have you talked to the principal? If you haven't gotten satisfaction there, go to the superintendent. That's, we're the last stop for these kinds of things. And so I really can't get involved at this level. It also can make some of the board work very challenging because of conflicts of interest. Every board, we strongly encourage every board to have a conflict of interest policy and a code of ethics that every board member should sign. If there is even a perceived conflict of interest, you are at risk of really losing the trust of your fellow board members. And once you've done that, you can't function as a board anymore. The board is a team. No individual on the board has any power other than as a unit. So if your kid's teacher says to you, oh, you're on the board, can't you fix this? Or the neighbor in the supermarket, you need to really know which hat you're wearing and how you go about doing it. It's hard to be hands-off when that's not the culture and the climate of a place, but you do need to remember what your role is as a board member.
And we have another question.
Oh, great. Okay.
A few are popping up now. Mary Lou says, is it okay to inform the principal when there's a word on the street about something that may be a problem?
I think you can pretty well assume the principal knows it, especially if it's a small town. But the board or a board member is not the right mouthpiece for that news. So if you're aware of it, another parent is too.
Okay, and Katie says, just a comment to add, I think being a parent of a student at the school and being on the school board is a benefit. I have a better idea of what's going on at the school and have a more personal relationship with other parents and teachers to encourage involvement.
I agree with you completely. I think you just need to be cautious not to overstep that. I would hope no board member / parent would go to the principal of the building expecting special favors, because that crosses the line. And so that's where I say it's sometimes tricky to remember which hat you're wearing. You're not going to stop advocating for your own child, of course. And that's where that conflict of interest policy comes into play, where you really want to pay attention to that.
Okay, I think that's all of our questions, unless anyone else has any others.
So you have here the contact information for all of us at the Vermont School Boards Association office. I encourage you to make use of it as necessary, or don't hesitate to call us. Don't be afraid to call us. We don't bite, and if we can't answer your questions on the spot, we will do our research and get back to you. And finally, I just want to thank you again for joining us this evening. I hope that this has been helpful. I encourage you to explore our website. There are a lot of great tools on there. And I personally also want to thank you for serving on your school board and providing the important role that you do for Vermont's children. It's not an easy job, but it really depends on people like you. So thank you very much.